Hey,
Hi,
Kathy.
Sam. How are you?
Doing well.
Awesome. So
Where are you?
today I'm super well, thank you. I'm just going to introduce you real quick. For anyone who doesn't know, Sam Hammond, the Director of Social Policy at the Niskanen Center, prolific tweeter, and my good friend and ex-boyfriend. Thank you so much for your time today, Sam. Anything I missed?
No, I think you covered it.
Awesome. Yeah, so I wanted to speak with you today about, any topics you want to discuss, but the thing that I've been focusing on most recently is the plight of US native born men, and particularly things that we see like polarization, atomization, kind of a move toward reactionary politics, low and declining labor force participation rates, the rise of men who are not in education, employment, or training, things like that, and some possible policy solutions to some of these problems. And then any kind of cultural analysis that you think is important to bring up as well. I know that your work focuses a lot on welfare and social assistance programs. There's a big theme in a lot of the writing around neat men that social assistance is actually part of the problem and contributing to the situation. Do you think there's any merit to that?
Not in the case of single childless men. In fact, like the U.S. social safety net is weakest for childless single men, almost non-existent. Like TANF, which is the main welfare program, doesn't even recognize single childless men for eligibility. There are other sorts of programs, however. I mean, one of the intersecting trends that you have to juxtapose with declining labor force participation and stuff like that is the rise of people living with their parents and the kind of delayed or arrested development, the delayed jumpstart into a career. And it's hard to pin down exactly what's causing this. I think there are bigger macro trends. The boomers holding on to their housing wealth makes it harder to start a family. Rising education and credentialing standards delays when you get to start your career. The relative decline in working when you're in high school and doing kind of crappy entry-level jobs and working your way up. Yeah, I don't think there's any one causal explanation. Obviously, the change in work towards the knowledge economy is one of the bigger ones when it comes to um, uh, sex imbalance and stuff like that. The women are graduating with bachelor's degrees at much higher rates than men at this point, um, and what that causes is all the women in your hometown move to go to college, and suddenly your hometown has a sex imbalance, and the college that they're going to has a sex imbalance in the opposite direction. And so there's also this sort of musical chair problem where there's mismatch in the marketplace for mates.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I hadn't really thought about that. I'm wondering whether these women tend to move back to their hometowns, or I guess because I definitely see in cities like San Francisco, sorry, not San Francisco, it's the exception, New York and DC, you have more college educated women than college educated men in those cities. I'm wondering about other major economic hubs, Chicago, let's say, whether the gender imbalance is similar. It certainly seems like to an extent, college educated men kind of have their pick of women, because most matings are assortative. Most women who have a degree want a man with a degree. Most heterosexual couples want the man to have slightly more or similar levels of education and income.
Be six
So
foot
it makes,
four.
sorry, oh yeah, well, there's preferences. Yeah, so it makes sense that, I mean, in Alienated America, Tim Carney talks about the kind of, brain drain, and not just brain, but like the people who would make up the leaders of civil society leaving their hometowns and the people being left not really having those leaders, and so the civil society kind of crumbles. But I hadn't really thought about the gendered aspect of that, where there would be more men, marriageable or marriage age men than women in those places. That's an interesting.
Yeah, no, Helen Andrews has made that argument too in the context of female labor force participation, right? That before there was a big increase in women moving into labor markets. It wasn't as if they were just sitting around doing nothing all day. They were organizing community, and
right.
And so it's only natural to expect some of these civil society or institutions to crumble. Obviously, secular decline in unionization and stuff like that matters as well. The decline in membership-based parties, where being a Democrat or being a Republican meant showing up to the convention and stuff like that. But I think the bigger drivers are probably labor market and these mismatch dynamics. And there's not really an easy solution, right? Because knowledge work and managerial work, which is the other big source of employment growth. Things like nursing, these are more gendered professions, for better or worse, and the kinds of traits that employers select for, say in a management role, are the more conscientious types, and men obviously can be conscientious, but we can also also be very non-conscientious, especially if you're among the cohort that's struggling the most.
Yeah, and that's another interesting aspect of it, is that the men with lower levels of income and education tend to be more, what's the word for it? Wedded to gendered expectations, wedded to a gender binary, wedded to a more traditional idea of masculinity and femininity, which makes it both more difficult for them to take on the wife role in a marriage, and makes it more difficult for them to take on these roles that are coded female right now. And I'm with you. I really think that the central problem of marriage right now, and we need to recognize the fact that not being married impacts men much more severely negatively than not being married impacts women. Men are less healthy, less happy, and more lonely when they're single versus women, which I think then snowballs into these issues of atomization and radicalization and grievance politics. But yeah, as long as the demand for feminine coded labor, or labor that's genderless, but men and women are equally suited to by default, as women get more education, the labor market demands more education. And I think I had Shoshana on from our street, and we talked about some of the barriers to getting men in the labor force, the growing licensure requirements and hoops you have to go through. Obviously that's a problem, but at the end of the day, if it's becoming not useful to be masculine in our economy and in our marriages, I just don't see a way around a rethinking of masculinity to give these men something to do.
Right, but I guess that the crux there is then how much do you attribute to innate factors versus culturally encoded factors? And I tend to think that that this is that nature and nurture is a false dichotomy, but the ways in which nature manifests in culture, that's the part that's variable and varies across the world and based on the world development and stuff like that. But there are genuine differences between men and women. Sexual dimorphism is one of the most tested propositions there are in psychology, and that's not to say that there aren't exceptions, that there aren't non-binary people, that there aren't other kinds of edge cases. But for the 90% plus of Americans who are cisgendered and so on, there are very deep-seated gender differences, and those will cash out in the form of different occupational preferences, different expectations that are mostly implicit. And right, and so it's not that you can make a sweeping generalization and say that all men want to or that all men want to be the breadwinner or something like that. I don't think that's the case at all. But I do think that there is a degree of self-worth and esteem that men get when they feel like they have status, and the status is in terms of resources, like income and a good job, or it could be because they're at the top of the pecking order and their city gang or something like that. There's all kinds of ways that you can get status, to be the best whatever Valorant player. And so maybe one solution to this is not to fight against the male nature of wanting to acquire resources and status, but to create new ways of acquiring resources and status that are less zero sum.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to dig into that further, like how, what are the useful ways to help men acquire resources and status that are, positive sum and in keeping with, and I obviously I'm not going to deny that some gender differences are, innate or biological. I do question, it does feel to me that that gender essentialism is overestimated a lot of times. I mean, we definitely see throughout, time and space that what is considered masculine does change based on context and resources and, incentives. And so I just, like right now we see, for example, and I don't know how it is in the rest of the world, but at least in American society, that men tend to be less conscientious, less agreeable than women on average. But we also see that little boys are socialized to be less conscientious and agreeable than little girls are. Little girls are heavily punished for not being conscientious and for not being agreeable in a way that's not true of boys. And so I'm wondering, how difficult is it going to be, in your opinion, to shift our conceptions of masculinity? I guess, what barrier does nature, just to use shorthand, or innate gender differences, like how much of a barrier is that going to be, do you think, to a reconceptualization of masculinity that would enable men to find status and meaning and purpose in things that are currently coded feminine, like being the leader of the PTA or being the primary caregiver, or doing feminine coded labor?
I mean, obviously status is always relative, right? So it's I think the way you create useful status hierarchies for men to compete on, or to basically fragment the forms of competition, and in some ways that's already happening, right? If you're, I mentioned like Valorant or like video games, that's one area. And maybe that's one reason why men are spending more time playing video games, is because they're trying to climb to the top of that particular pyramid. But I think being the head of the PTA is a form of status. Being just one nurse among many, or something like that, is not as appealing to most men. So I'm really reluctant to think of human nature as a barrier to anything. I think it's, we shape our hammer to fit our hand rather than some idealized appendage. and just the social technologies are tools just the same. We should try to mold them to our natures rather than the reverse. So there's certain empirical questions you have to settle in terms of what is malleable, what's not. But in the case of gender differences, it is this hard thing to disentangle, because you have socialization, but you also have genetics, and they are co-determinists and they happen at the same time. And how do you disentangle causality And that's where things like twin studies and cross-national studies and things come in handy, because it really does turn out that, certainly there's ways that socialization adds the content, right, of what is coded as masculine in a particular day and age. And some things are obviously more arbitrary than others, just like evolution doesn't care too much about hair color. Um, but to think that they're totally malleable can lead to bad places, and can really cloud your policy response. That's a I would say to that. I mean, a good example would be like, for generations, most people are right-handed, right? And for generations, there are people who are left-handed who are forced to write with the right hand, and that was cruel and unusual. And it's good that we don't do that anymore. But you also shouldn't redesign society so that there are 50% left-handed scissors and 50% right-handed scissors.
Yeah, no, I think a system that works against biology is going to be not ideal. Certainly, it's just a question of what actually is biological and what is cultural, and what are these cultural. I don't know. It just feels like we're socializing boys for a world that doesn't exist anymore. We're socializing boys to be rowdy and rambunctious and competitive and loud and physical and not conscientious, and to see, go ahead.
Well, big five personality traits are probably some of the most, all personality research is a little bit suspect, but like big five are the traits that are most likely to be stable over your lifetime. They are very heritable. So, I mean, you can have a girl who grows up with a bunch of older brothers will be a little more rough and tumble, right? And so there are ways socialization changes us on the margin, and again can fill in certain content where you learn you become Islamic if you grow up in Egypt, but you become Christian if you grow up in the South in the US. So it's like, but at the end of the day, there's a deeper religious communal group impulse that those cultural markers are just filling a kind of a form. And it works. I think it works the same with a lot of these gender relation questions. And we shouldn't assume that we just need to make men more adaptable to the current reality. The current reality could change. Obviously, technology is going to continue, and there could be all kinds of surprises in the future. In terms of like how these opportunity costs and stuff balance out, and what kind of behaviors get incentivized. But then there's also just been like what Tyler Cowen and others have called the feminization of society and culture. That's a trend that could reverse. It's a trend that could face some kind of backlash, and it's a trend that you could potentially use policy to balance it as well.
Yeah, I'd love for you to. Indian Bronson mentioned the feminization, Tyler Cowen's stuff before. I'd love to dig into that a little further. I mean, I think to an extent, there's definitely a feminization of education that's been really not helpful to anyone. I think education is definitely an area where we're producing, boys and girls, but girls are just better able to overcome it. We're training people for a reality that doesn't exist anymore. And that's a huge missed opportunity. But I'm curious about like how it seems to me, for example, like, I don't know, making it about feminization or masculinization kind of misses the point that like K through 12 is failing everyone. Like you're just graduating without any skills. In an economy that needs skills more than anything else. But I'm curious about what I'm missing about like the feminization of society and like why it matters. I'd love it if you could just kind of like briefly summarize.
Maybe it'd be useful to just give an example. So you mentioned education. Academia is an epicenter for feminization. It's definitely part of this broader trend in terms of managerialism and more administrative roles and things like that that are often, for better or worse, populated with women. HR departments, stuff like that. That's like the stereotype. Or in the case of higher ed, the kind of student services and stuff like that. So if you look at like econ seminars, economics was historically notorious for having very disagreeable cultures around their seminars, where you'd be giving a presentation and people would be raising their hand to object to something that's on the first slide. It's like, well, geez, give me a chance to get through it. But that was like part of the ethic of scrutiny that was applied. And there's definitely been a trend, at least anecdotally, where that's become more out of fashion. And you also have folks who, in whether it's econ or physics or other programs, that are like, we need to make this more accommodating for women in STEM or something like that. And so we need to be more gentle. And in some ways, it's almost like patronizing to women that they can't, take some criticism. But more often than not, I see that the demand for that coming from women themselves, sometimes vicariously on behalf of someone else. And that can, that has pluses and minuses. There's ways in which feminization has been obviously an unalloyed good, like the broader decline in violence. There's all kinds of ways where it's a positive. The question is like on the margin and in particular contexts. And if we're able to have open and honest discussions about the costs and benefits of both masculinity and femininity.
Yeah, and it kind of sounds like, to some extent, it sounds like it's less like a concerted effort to feminize and more just a combination of women being valuable, more valuable than we've ever been in the market economy, women coming into fields at greater numbers than ever before, and women taking our preferences and norms and getting them to be more normal. That makes sense. And so if we expect the demand for femininity, let's just say, to increase, and the demand for masculinity as currently understood to stay stable or decrease, what's then to be done with these men? How do we get them plugged into something useful?
Yeah, what's the first thing to say is, like, I'm not confident enough to say that we can just extrapolate linearly from what's happened over the last 40 years or so. I would say, as a diagnosis of the last 40 years, it's true that femininity has increased and masculinity is the rewards of masculinity have decreased. Sometimes quite literally, right? Like, so, stagnant wages among men without high school degrees is at least in part the reduction of a rent that men used to receive when women worked up to the labor market. So there has been a real redistribution implicit there. But looking forward, like, in the same way that since the 70s, manufacturing employment peaked and declined, we can't be sure that over the next 40 years, the kinds of roles that the kinds of dynamics that have promoted recent feminization might not reverse. So, like, a good example, we just talked about managerial jobs and administrative jobs and bureaucracies and stuff like that, or even healthcare. Like, those are all areas where AI is really well suited to automate a lot of work. So it becomes much less clear about how to predict going forward. But the policy solutions are kind of, at least in the near term, are kind of obvious. We should be disinvesting on the margin from college for all models of education.
College what?
college for all models of broadening vocational apprenticeship type pathways.
Yeah.
Even doing tracking in high school would be useful. A lot of male dysfunction sort of peaks and declines after you're 25 years old. More concentrated attention on how to deal with that population. And then geographically, like a lot of these mismatches might solve themselves if the education and labor market dynamics change. But even if they don't, these are transitory dynamics, because the town that lost all its marriageable women to college is not reproducing itself. So in generations from now, we're all going to be in cities anyway.
Yeah. We're going to be in cities, but I mean, it's difficult for me to imagine a scenario absent like more war, where the traits we code as masculine currently are going to grow in value, at least some of them. Like, it's hard for me to imagine an economy in the future where like physical strength is a major plus, again, because of automation. And so I'm just curious about like, what are some of your potential scenarios where demand for masculine labor increases relative to demand for feminine labor?
Well, if the demand for feminine labor decreases and nothing else changes, then that's a relative increase. But it's really hard to predict. There have been like these two concurrent trends: one where men are getting more into weightlifting and stuff like that, and then one where men are getting more into like skincare, and sometimes they're the same men. So it's not. There may be just purely cosmetic approaches to masculinity. The point about war is interesting. It's definitely true that there are no gender egalitarians and foxholes, right? Like we go to war and we want to win the war, and when things are existential, you sweep away a lot of the ideology and just try to recognize that like a man in combat can carry back their fallen comrade because they're have more muscle density and stuff like that. So
it's also true that a woman can operate a drone as well as a man, and that's
right.
the direction war is going in. So even in that scenario, it's just not clear to me that the masculinity as currently conceived is ever going to be the advantage it was.
No, I agree with that. Especially like in the metaverse or whatever we're going towards. So there may not be a clear answer. It may just be that people have to voluntarily opt into communities that valorize more forms of manual and martial virtue. But it's one of those things where like it's clear that like one of the forces, at least chemically and hormonally, that leads to declining testosterone levels and stuff like that, it's just how sedentary we are. And it was hard to find like fat people in the 1940s. Like someone who was like mildly obese was like the circus fat man. That's because people were active and just moving around, and didn't have tons of calories. So one of the ways that artificial intelligence may play a role here is in helping people with self-control. To the extent that we all have like super intelligent personal assistants, the kinds of behaviors that lead to sedentary, short-termist kind of lifestyles that aren't fulfilling, that don't create meaning. You can break yourself out of that, but it's often easier if you have a community. And in lieu of a community, like the reason the community is useful is because you have peers who are providing motivation and pressure and setting examples. I don't think we'll ever be like totally atomized in that at that level, but for folks who are, like having having a AI that can, tell you to get off the couch, or to pump you up, or or whatever. There could be all kinds of ways where automation actually leads to a kind of return to more organic modes of life, because we choose to do them, not because we're forced to do them.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I'm very pro technology, pro innovation. It just seems to me that especially young childless men in America are suffering from like a crisis of meaning and purpose. And I don't see, I could see an AI as like a first step toward getting to a place of meaning and purpose potentially, but it just seems like the barriers to meaning and purpose and community and connection are just,
No, the
for all
stack
intents and purposes.
The deck is definitely stacked towards the Brave New World scenario, where we use intelligence, just like have sex bots and and have like chat bots, that like the movie Her, where we fall in love with our personal assistant. And that's not a very pretty outcome.
Yeah, it's very depressing.
Right, but that's why I think there's been also this sort of shift in the rationalist world towards rediscovering tradition and stuff like that, where, and I don't think it's like been a sacrifice of the rationality so much as rediscovering the implicit rationality in certain older school norms. And monogamy is one of those, right? Like we talk about, when Robin Hanson got excoriated for talking about sex redistribution, I think it's because people had in mind that he was going to have paramilitary militias rounding up women and redistributing them across the hinterland or something like that, which is I can understand the confusion, because it's a very poignant way of describing the concept. But like, no, monogamy was a kind of sex redistribution. Arranged marriages in India are a kind of sex redistribution, and their primary purpose was to maintain a kind of equilibrium.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important, is that monogamy is for the benefit of low status men. That in a society where monogamy isn't a norm, then you will often have a few high status men getting all the pussy, and a lot of low status men
as it is, right?
Yeah, and so monogamy helps smooth that out for sure. And I think that's a useful technology, but we're just in a place where it just doesn't work mathematically. Yeah, there's one woman for every man, but if every woman is expecting a man who's slightly better educated and higher income than she is, and there aren't enough higher income, higher educated men to go around, it's a math problem at the end of the day. And so either the men have to get degreed and paid, or the women have to lower their standards, or something else has to happen. And so yeah, but I don't know.
It's not so much lower their standards, but and this applies to men and women. It's not about lowering of standards. It's about localizing your standards, right? Because a lot of the Jonathan Haidt stuff on Instagram and social media usage, driving, anorexia and eating disorders and stuff like that. Like there is that's not because women have risen their standards too much in terms of like sex appeal and body image and stuff like that, so much as like globalized their standards, where they're comparing themselves to the 99th percentile in the world, rather than in their local community. And the same thing happens with men, where like you feel, I think mass media and communications technology is partly to blame here. Like you felt like $100,000, your job was really, really good, until your buddy who moved away from home and like went to Berkeley or something, I guess, like making $500,000 at McKinsey or something, your group, your universe of comparison cases has gotten so big that everyone is dissatisfied because there's always someone better.
I mean, that's an interesting point, and I think it matters. I'm not sure it matters to this discussion because it's like super universal that women aren't looking for a guy with a PhD, and I mean they are of course looking for $100,000 job, but what ends up happening is men and women both choose partners who are where the man is just slightly above. And so, and I agree that, my phrasing was poor. I don't think that it's a lowering of standards necessarily to say, I don't need my husband to have a degree or I don't need him to make more money than me. But it is a changing of standards that if every woman does expect this, it is a math problem. And so the standards are going to have to, again, the men are going to have to step up in these areas, or they're going to have to step up possibly in other areas, and women are going to have to adjust their expectations accordingly if we're going to get everybody married off. But I'm on the cheap Zoom and I'm almost out of time. So I wanted to give you a chance for any last thoughts and to let people know where they can learn more about you and read more of your stuff.
Hammond Cheese on Twitter. That's about it. It's good to see you, Kathy.
You too, Sam. Cool. Thanks for coming on, and I will talk to you soon.
Peace.